Welcome everybody. So this is the last video we are going to have on HTML and CSS. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to use CSS to sort of structure the page. So we've talked a lot about how to use it to style individual elements or categories of elements. But one of the other really powerful things CSS can do is give you a page that has like a left bar where you've got a bunch of content or a menu on top, or lets you sort of arrange multiple elements with respect to each other in a smart way. So we're going to do this video a little bit differently. I've spent some time putting together a little demonstration page that's going to show how some of these structuring features of CSS work. So I want to just sort of walk you through what I've got here. You'll notice I've got two HTMLs, and both are referencing the same style sheet. And there's no reason not to do that. I'm using classes very heavily in the way I've built this. And you'll notice I've got divs inside of divs here. And a div is not just an arbitrary container that allows you to set styling. And so these are really, they just contain text. You can see that's all that's inside of them. But your divs could have links inside of them. They could have images. They could have HTML canvas elements, stuff like that. So we'll start with the simpler one first. And you'll notice this has a body. It's got two big divs, the left bar and the main page class. And then we've got left bar content is separate from content, which is the main page content. And so if we look in my CSS, so the classes here are left bar content, main page, and content. We can see how I'm styling them. So here's left bar content. And I'm not going to dwell on this styling right now. I just want to show you where it is. Here's main page. And then content is right above it. So I could actually arrange this a little bit better. Left bar content, main page, and content. And this is going to be sort of all of the styling for that. And it doesn't matter what order this stuff is in. That's going to be all the styling for that. So I'm going to save all of this. And I'm going to open up this page in Chrome just to show you what it looks like. Oh, not a location. Open a file. I've been doing this for 3 weeks and I still click on the wrong thing. Okay, so this is the bar test. Okay, so what is going on here is I wanted to show how to make a page that has a left bar with like navigation links, stuff like that, and then a main bar on the right. And obviously these colors are very bright just so you can tell where the dividing lines are. And so the first thing I'll talk about is how the left bar and the right bar are styled, or the left bar and the main page. So I'm going to sort of squish these next to each other so we can take a look at them. So the left bar has a width, and it's taking up 20% of the page. It's got a background color, and it's got this property called overflow X. That's really all that's styled on the left bar. Now there is an important thing in the body. The display property is one of the more complicated CSS properties, but it generally tells you how the objects inside of a container are going to be organized relative to each other. And so in this case, body is our biggest container on this page. And flex is a really, really useful display mode. We talked about block and inline. There's some other ones. If I change this to block, it's totally going to wreck my page because it's going to force all of these items to be on their own. See, this is what a block content looks like. The left bar, which is styled blue, is on its own, takes up its whole own horizontal rule. And the I forget what I call this. Yeah, the main page also takes up its own horizontal rule. So in order to get these to work the way I want to, I have to set it to flex. And picking these display styles, you need to know what the basics are, but there's a lot of trial and error in this. And I spent a bunch of time messing around with this and Googling to get the effects I wanted. And now that I've done that, I can share them with you to save you some of that trouble. So this display flex is why I'm getting these two things side by side. And it's why I can... You'll also notice I set the height to 100%. That's why this takes up more space than the actual content does. So if I set this height to 80%, again on the body, so the body is saying how its contained elements are behaving. So that's the top level contained elements. And it's only going to go 80% down the page, and that doesn't look as good. This flex wrap property, the margin property is also important. That makes it go all the way out to the sides. That's just how I wanted it to look. And the The flex wrap property is not something that this page is using, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So, just to sort of recap, the body sets how these the left bar content in the main, the left bar and the main page are arranged. And it's really important to have it at height 100% for this effect I want to achieve. And it's really important to have the display flex. It's also important to have the margin at 0, or else it'll be bumped in from the edges here. So on the left bar in the main page, I only have to style the width and the background color. And then it's got this property overflow X that we'll talk about in a minute. But this left bar, main page, and the body styling are how I achieve this basic setup. So you'll notice the left bar content, I'm just setting a height and a width because that's how I want it to look. I'm giving it a border and a margin to sort of break these up a little bit, because you could imagine these would be different links or something like that. You're probably not going to put hard borders around them like that, but you get the idea of stacked content. So I could mess around with their display, but honestly I don't really need to because of the way I've styled it. So one of the nice things about that overflow X property, and this just says if it overflows its horizontal rule, you hide it, but it changes the behavior a little bit. And I don't know why it does this, but I do know that it lets me do something I want to, which is it sort of acts like a separate little pane. If you see, I'm adding a bunch more divs in here so that it overflows, and it lets me scroll it independently, which is something you might want to do, again, if you've got a table of contents or something like that on a website. Or if you've got a list of things you're choosing from, and you click on this and it changes what's on the right pane over here. That's something you could do with JavaScript relatively easily. So if I take away that overflow X in the CSS, that overflow X hidden, it's going to look really ugly. Now, why does it do that? This is what I would expect it to do, right? I set the width as the height is 100, and then it overflows. It overflows below, and it just sort of gets put on the page in a way that does not look how we wanted it to. I wonder, yeah, it might work with overflow Y as well, but it sort of doesn't matter because I've achieved the effect that I want, right? And you can see on the right page, on the right pane, it should do the same thing if I add a bunch of content where I can scroll it individually. But with this setup, I would say you probably want to set up the right pane so it's not going to scroll. So to sort of recap this one, what is important here is I set a flex display on my body, which is containing the left bar and the main page. I set a height of 100 and a margin of 0, so it would fill the entire page. On left bar and on main page, I set the widths manually, so I'm filling 100% of the width. I set overflow X to hidden so that it will behave independently, or that the X overflow doesn't just spill onto the bottom. And I just gave it some colors to make it look distinct. So I'm gonna get rid of these so I can get rid of that scroll bar, and we can see sort of this page just how I had originally designed it. Again, you're probably not going to use these colors. This is just for illustration. But some of the other things we're using here is we're heavily using divs to structure this, because divs are very good for sort of setting up your basic structuring elements. And we're heavily using classes, because that's how I think about when I'm thinking about setting up a page like this. I'm usually thinking in terms of classes and thinking in terms of styling classes. I could, on the left bar and the main page, I could also use an ID and use an ID selector in my CSS. But again, that's not the habit I'm in when I'm building this stuff. So let's take a look at this other page I've got that demonstrates some other sort of structuring properties of CSS. And I'm going to go ahead and open that in Chrome as well. And that, I believe, is my index.html. So this sort of came out of experimenting with the different types of display styles, because I wanted to get a really good understanding of how they worked, and I wanted to talk about how you can use those display styles to organize content inside of your divs, because divs are one of the most important structuring elements. So let's take a look at this index.html, and this is how it shows up here. And you'll notice that I've got a flex div that has a bunch of content in it. I've got a block div that has a bunch of content in it. And I've got an inline div that has a bunch of content in it. And the way I'm styling these is flex div has a display flex, block div has a display blocks, and inline div has a display inline flex. And so you can see the content aside, it's just put one right after the other inside of the HTML. So the fact that the flex div is all fitting on one line, the fact that the block div content all gets its own line, and the fact that the inline flex looks like this, that is entirely from the display styling in CSS. I've got the margin down here, margin auto down here that's centering it, but I'm really not doing much to get these very different behaviors here. The other thing you'll notice is it's doing what's called wrapping, which is where if my window gets too small to fit it all, it's causing it to break across to the next line. And so we talked about that flex wrap property right here. That's what that's doing. I could set this to no wrap, and because my body is a flex container, right? So all three of these divs are inside of a flex container, and each of these little contents inside of these is inside of its containing div, right? So, and I can actually look at this. This is something you can use, again, the Chrome developer tools to look at. That's not how we get to them. There we go. I can pick one of these out. So I can see my different container levels. But there should be a way to see. This is how we do the padding. Yeah, I guess you can see it here, right? The body is a flex. This div is a flex, and then I've got content inside of it. The body is a flex. This div is a block div, and inside of it I've got content, and again down here I've got the flex, the inline flex. So you can use the Chrome developer tools to sort of explore, and you'll see how it's highlighting different parts of this to understand what is containing what and why it's setting it up the way it does. So let's go back to that wrap property, because I just changed it to no wrap. I didn't save it. I didn't reload it. And now it is just going to, because again, this is a flex container, and a flex container is going to put all of this stuff, if it's no wrap, it's going to put all the stuff in the same, it's going to fill the horizontal space with all of the stuff. And so it's filling 100% of the height, which is specified in the body. So if I could change this, I could actually get rid of this height property, and then it'll just sort of automatically select what height it needs, which is going to be lower. And you'll see that it's as tall as the longest element. And again, that's a property of a flex container. But without the wrap property, or with the wrap property set to no wrap, let's change the height back to 100% because I like it that way. It is not wrapping these, it is shrinking them. As I get smaller, it's sort of shrinking them up together. So this is really about how you want your page to be styled. Do you want things to break onto the next line? And you're not going to have probably these types of divs, but if you think about having like a bunch of different little icons you could click on, or having tiles, that's a really common metaphor for laying out websites, is having a bunch of different tiles. Sometimes you'll want those to break onto the next page so that if the window gets really narrow, you only have 1 or 2 instead of 3 or 4. That's really up to you. The real purpose of this video is to give you a sense of how to use the display styles to organize things inside of containers. So I want to recap. I want to reload this with my breaking. And I want to recap about the different styles. So this body, the main page, has a wrapping flex container, and it is generally going to try and fill the horizontal space, and because it's wrapping, it'll break if there's not enough room. Inside of the flex div is a standard non-wrapping flex container, and you'll see how it squishes up. Inside of the red block div is a block container, and so all of the content gets its own line because all of the content inherits this display block property. And then the inline div is a little bit different. It displays inline, which means that it doesn't necessarily take up its own element. It's going to be all on the same line, and because it's not a pure flex container, and we could change this to flex and you'd see what happens. Interesting. I wonder if that's because I have margin auto. So it is behaving basically the same. Let's take away the margin auto. I bet that's going to do it. Now it should take up the whole line. Yeah, so and you can see it's wrapping a little bit differently. The margin auto sort of tells it to fit to the content. Okay. And the inline flex, I got to reload. Since it's next to a block container, the inline and the inline flex look the same, but it would look a little bit different. You're probably not going to use. Probably not going to use this, but if you do, play around with it and see. You can see that's what I'm doing right. That's what I'm doing right now. Play around with it, see how it behaves, and figure out how you wanna use it. But by far the most valuable container here is the flex. That's a really good one. If you need stuff to be on its own line, that's a block display. And just think in terms of when you're structuring your page, think in terms of what is containing what, and what display style do you want to use to achieve the orientation and the sort of flow that you want. So there is no skills check for this video. This is really for your information. As you're working on your personal projects, you're gonna think about ways you want your page to be structured, and this basic, strategy of building divs and setting their display styles and maybe even setting absolute widths and absolute heights and stuff like that. That's going to be a useful way of thinking about how to do the large scale structure on your page. So this, like I said, this is our last HTML and CSS video. Obviously, I am happy to help as you're working through your HTML and CSS. But from here on out, you are going to be expected to do your own research on how to do those parts. So after this, we're going to switch back to JavaScript, which is going, now that we've got sort of pretty good chops with the elements and the style, we're going to work on how to change the behavior. And once you are done with this video, you are ready to move on to the next JavaScript video. And as always, if you have any questions, anything you didn't understand, raise your hand and we will take a look at it together.